How the guitars were sold varies quite a lot. It certainly varies as we get to the post-war period. In the pre-war period, where Czechoslovakia and Saxony were working very, very closely together, within Markneukirchen, they had established a large group of wholesalers who essentially took the finished instrument and wholesaled them. The makers did not generally sell straight to the retail outlet, to the shop. They sold to wholesalers who traveled, and they'd travel around Germany, they'd travel to America. I've talked to you before about the fact that the Americans even set up a consulate in Markneukirchen in the late 19th century. And certainly by into the 1930s, the Hofner Company employed a traveling salesman in the USA who would come back once a year with the orders to head office. They would take the orders, they would build the instruments and ship them out over the course of the following year. Within Czechoslovakia, they had built up a really strong export trade, very much to England and to the United States. What happened after the war was, of course, all of those networks were destroyed and had to be rebuilt. And the East Germans and the West Germans took very different paths. Within West Germany, they quickly built back up to the traditional wholesaling and retailing patterns, and as communications improved, by the time you got into the 1950s, the West German makers had their names on the guitars. They were marketing them as well as you could in the 50s. They were selling them through wholesalers. They were selling them directly to stores. And quite a lot of our West German collection have stores' names on the headstocks. And collectors who don't know much about them will often think, oh, I've got a Jürgensen guitar. Well, actually, it's not. Jürgensen was a shop in Dusseldorf who tended to put its names on the guitars. In East Germany, you had communism. You had the drive to centralize production, supply, sales, employment. However, communism didn't happen quickly. People tend to think the Russians came in, Russian occupied zone, you're behind the Iron Curtain. The Iron Curtain was not actually physically there until about 1960, 61. Berlin Wall did not go up until then. What you had was a gradually increasing protection of the borders. But in the immediate post-war period, that border was more a concept than a fact. And people could travel very, very freely backwards and forwards across the border. Between 1945 and 1953, I'll get the number wrong, but something like 3.5 million Germans just wandered across and established themselves in West Germany. So there was a trade in selling guitars to the West. It was illegal to sell it for the Western currency, but the Western currency was a lot more valuable. You were in a period after the war where a lot of trade was barter or it was black market, so people wanted to get their hands on foreign currency. In East Germany after the war, they did want to start building up a centralized selling organization, but it took probably until the late 1950s until it was becoming established. They'd had a trade organization called MIGMA since the 1930s in Markneukirchen, and this is what the East German state decided to begin to use as its sourcing company. So if you wanted to buy woods or strings or machine heads for the guitars, you gradually began to find over the years that you couldn't get them on the market anymore. You had to start buying them through MIGMA, and certainly by the beginning of the 1960s, you were not able to buy them anywhere other than through MIGMA. So they decided to start doing the same thing with sales, and they built up a couple of sales organizations, the main one of which happened to be MIGMA. They used that for the sales, but there were one or two others as well. However, they didn't kill off completely the independent wholesalers that had been in East Germany before the war. And so you do still find, 15 or 20 names of those original wholesalers being used in East Germany right through into the 1960s. So I think even the Russians knew there was a bit of value in marketing and in a well-known name.